What is a ghost's favourite drink? Booze. What happens if a ghost drinks too much booze? He gets sheet-faced. Look, I've done 60 of these videos. I'm running out of jokes. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Bad Country. So first off, this video is not going to be for everyone. In fact, it's barely even about alcohol. It's more about cycling. But I rarely take the chance to talk about this kind of thing. And I figured because I'm not really in a headspace to talk about anything very dark and gloomy, I would take the chance to talk about this experience I had. I try to make my stuff really relatable, even though a lot of my experiences are kind of not relatable. But this story is just not very relatable. Not everybody's going to be able to connect with what I'm talking about here. And that's okay. They don't all have to be crowd pleasers. So this video is just really for me, just because I wanted to talk about something kind of interesting. And it's also for the very hardcore kind of Bad Country fans who occasionally tell me that they don't really care what I talk about, they would watch anyway. So thank you to those of you who say stuff like that, thank you. It gives me a bit of freedom to experiment with the content here. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to just tell you a thing that happened. The story I'm about to relate, you might be familiar with it already because it's a whole chapter of my book, Just Crazy Enough to Work. But I haven't talked about any of this stuff really on the channel. So why not? The reason why it's relevant, the reason why I think it's okay to talk about on a channel that's about alcoholism and sobriety, is because the event that I'm about to describe, I traced this moment in time to the beginning of my complete downward spiral into chronic alcoholism. I'd had a problem before this. It'd been a problem for a very long time. I tried to get a handle on it, and then this event happened. And after this, like from this moment on, it was just a descent into madness. So while the story is not very much about alcohol itself, or really about alcoholism, it's the start of my life, everything in my life, becoming about alcohol. So let's get into it. At the time of this story, I was 34. And I had been living in China, mostly Shanghai, for about 5 years. And that's really where alcohol started to get on top of me. And I had decided to try to starve the alcohol out. And it coincided. When you're editing this, remember to turn the fridge back on. Shanghai is where the alcohol and other things got on top of me. And I had made a decision to kind of starve that lifestyle out, to starve out the alcohol. And it coincided with a time that my job in Shanghai was being relocated to Zagreb in Croatia. And I took that opportunity to take a career break, slightly less than a year, with the intention of cycling from my old job in Shanghai, cycling alone across the Northern Silk Road, all the way from Shanghai back to Europe. And that was the plan. And I decided to use that journey to starve out the alcohol, to kind of take it out into the desert and choke it to death in the sand and leave it there. Men. We would rather cycle across a desert than get help. That's how we think. Okay, so I left Shanghai and I joined, after about a month of cycling, I was in Xi'an, which is kind of like the beginning or the end, depending on which way you look at it, of the Silk Road, where the terracotta warriors are. And then I would trace that route. It's essentially one long road through the dead center of China, from Shanghai all the way to Lanzhou, and then the road splits and you go across the north of the Taklamakan Desert over to Kashgar near the border. And about a third of that journey, the western part of it, is entirely through Xinjiang. And if your knowledge of geopolitics is up to date, you'll know that Xinjiang is not a very easy place for a foreigner to be, especially one travelling alone. and especially after you accidentally tell a police checkpoint that you're a writer. I was stopped at a police checkpoint somewhere near the entrance to the desert, and they'd asked me what my occupation was. And it felt easier to me to say that I was a writer rather than say I work in advertising for sex toys. I felt like it would be easier to explain what a writer does than explain that a dildo salesman exists. But saying I was a writer, I meant that I wrote advertising, which is part of my job. I wasn't lying. But telling the police in Xinjiang that you are a writer, they interpreted it to mean that I was a journalist, which is one of the worst things you could possibly say in that region. And as a result of saying that, I was hounded across the entire region. Constant police stops. The police raided my hotel rooms more than once. Stopped every 5 minutes. I was definitely being followed for a large stretch of it. The same unmarked car would follow me, and then it would, after a few miles, it would peel off and be replaced by an identical car with different people in it. And I would notice that when I go through small towns, the security cameras would turn to follow my progress and stuff. I wasn't imagining it. It was real. And Xinjiang was hard going, man. It's a desert, but it's also at quite high altitude, like surprisingly high altitude. It's almost entirely above 1,000 meters in elevation, which means that it's a blisteringly hot, dry desert, but it's also freezing cold at night. It's a deeply inhospitable place. It's often described as a police state within a police state, and it really feels like that. My experience of it, apart from being kind of pursued by the police for a lot of it, was largely good, certainly interesting. And the locals who would speak to me were extremely friendly. But not everyone would, because there might be repercussions for them and for their families of speaking to someone who was very obviously a foreigner. And Xinjiang is enormous. It's almost 3 times the size of Texas. In your face, America. And it's somehow simultaneously a searingly hot desert and a freezing cold mountain plateau. It took me about 7 weeks to cycle the nearly 4,000 kilometers across Xinjiang. And just for full disclosure, just so I'm not being dishonest, due to the police surveillance and due to my visa getting close to expiring, the last couple of 100 kilometers I took a train. It wasn't possible to do it any other way. Annoyingly, I didn't quite cycle the whole way. And towards the end of the Chinese leg of the journey, alcohol had already started to creep back into my life. The mission, my goal, the whole purpose of the trip was, partially at least, was to stamp out the alcohol, to remove the opportunity for it. And the desire for it, by completely changing my lifestyle, by immersing myself into the coarseness of the world. And I thought that would stop me from drinking, at least for a while. Enough. It would stop me drinking long enough to emerge sober on the other end. But that didn't happen. In fact, on that train journey, I was drunk on that. And I arrived in a town. It's got a statue of Marco Polo in it, because Marco Polo also visited this desert town, this oasis town, and wrote about it in his travels. And there's a statue of him in the middle of the town on this roundabout, and I think it is the only time I've seen a statue of a Westerner in China. I'm not absolutely sure about it, but it's the only time I saw one. And in that tiny town, which was just such a reprieve from the harshness of the desert and the landscape. It wasn't quite desert by then. It was still very rocky, very, very inhospitable, very rugged. There was a bar with this kind of purplish lighting, a little bit like the one behind me, and velour seats, and it just felt out of place in the desert. And I sat in that bar alone and drank an entire bottle of Johnny Walker Red Label to myself in the bar, just in a glass with a ball of ice in it. And I was there for so long the ice would melt and I'd ask for another one. And I walked out of that bar and I wasn't even that drunk after that entire bottle that I'd had to myself. And that tells me one of two things. Either I was already supremely fit and in really good shape to be able to withstand that level of alcohol, or the second option, it was very watered down. Anyway, after that, after the Johnny Walker in that crazy little bar, I would occasionally grab like a chilled Suntory beer. I would occasionally grab a beer, but nothing as destructive as what would come later or what had come earlier when I was living in Shanghai. I went back to just kind of like being okay for a while. That would change after I crossed the border into Kyrgyzstan. To be honest, by that stage, by the late stage of the Chinese leg of the journey, which itself was, I don't know, 6,500 kilometers or something, I had already begun to unravel slightly. Even despite the sobriety of most of that period. I spent 7 weeks in that desert. And that was always the intention. I wanted to kind of test myself against the intensity of the desert. Should have just got a therapist. And I wanted it to be hard. But there are, even in the travel books and stuff that you read before you embark on a journey like this, it doesn't always tell you everything. So I was unraveling in quite strange ways. Out in the desert, I couldn't really keep much of my electronics charged. Not really. I had a solar panel, but I just didn't bother by then because I knew the direction. I was heading due west for the entire thing. There was no chance of me getting lost. And I just didn't need it very much. I'd stopped kind of listening to music and was just riding in silence. And I did this thing to keep my cycling cadence in check, where I would murmur song lyrics. And over time, it stopped being song lyrics and became like little snippets of sentences. That instead of being lyrics that I remembered, I would begin saying things in order to keep my cadence the same, so that I could do the distances that were required. And I didn't know that I was doing it. But I would be cycling and I would be saying things like, I like this bike, I like this bike, I like this bike, there is a dog, over and over again. Just whatever, like a complete stream of consciousness. And that was how I was like, also when I say cadence, I'm talking about breathing as well. That's how I was keeping myself going. I didn't realise that I was doing it until, skipping ahead slightly, I made it to the border with Kyrgyzstan. And when I was queuing up to be processed on the Kyrgyz side, there was a German tourist bus, and they had got off ahead of me, and I was behind this big, jolly kind of Bavarian German guy. And he looked over his shoulder at me as I stood behind him. And he looked at me as I was muttering to myself, and he said, "You have been alone a long time, yeah?" And that was when I realised that for weeks I had been talking to myself out loud. And God knows what it was I was saying, and it was almost beyond my control. It was kind of psychotic. Anyway, I won't bore you with the process of going across the border. That's not the point of what I want to tell you about. I'll just mention that the process of crossing the border from China to the outside is absolutely inhumane, incredibly stressful and dehumanizing, invasive and unnecessarily cruel. It's just awful, and it's not even a single border. So this particular border that I was crossing at, which is the Kyrgyzstan border, that border has about 150 kilometers kind of no man's land in between it, in between the two borders of China and Kyrgyzstan. And there's no travelling that expanse alone. No foreigner is going to be out on their own there. You can only go with a government-sanctioned guide and in a group. And it is incredibly stressful, and you're never quite sure if you're going to be able to make it across that day. The process is completely opaque. And that stretch of no man's land is surely a contender for the most beautiful stretch of land I've ever seen in my life. It's got these colourful, really vibrantly coloured, like purple and red and kind of green rocks, like in striations. It's a really strange landscape. It's very beautiful. But on the Chinese side of the border, it's kind of like a terminal. There's like metal detectors and a million cops and biometric sensors, and there's cameras everywhere. And it's very clinical and very oppressive once you leave China. And then you arrive at the Kyrgyz border, and it's just a single, very lonely, very cold-looking soldier in front of a chicken wire fence with a clipboard and pen, and that's it. And it was so refreshing after all of the bureaucracy and the officiousness and the inhumanity of Xinjiang. It was like a breath of fresh air stepping into Kyrgyzstan. And that would ultimately be part of my downfall, and I'll explain that when we get there. So I was desperately unprepared when I entered Kyrgyzstan. That was the nature of the journey. I had deliberately made it improvisational, with no itinerary, just a general direction to head west, and no real consideration of routes and plans. I kind of wanted to use it as an opportunity to fix problems on the fly. That was a lot of the purpose, was kind of like a test of myself. And I'm glad I took that approach, because if I had done a thorough route plan, or if I'd looked ahead at my journey on the Kyrgyzstan side of the border, I think I would have been very tempted to cheat. Because 6 kilometers, once you cross the border, you get out of the van, the government van, and I was given my bike. There's 6 kilometers into Kyrgyzstan, which is all flat through this kind of ravine. And then suddenly, I remember it so well, stopping at the bottom of this road as it curled to the right, and then it just went up. In a massive switchbacking rope of road, all the way up this mountain pass. It's quite famous, well, not famous, it's relatively renowned amongst certain kinds of travellers, like long-distance motorbikers and cyclists, for being a bit of a test. It's called the Taldic Pass. It's sometimes also called the Torgat Pass, or there's some confusion over which is which. But I can tell you, like, when I woke up that morning on the Chinese side of the border, I was at 1,200 meters elevation, and the top of that pass, the Taldic Pass, is very close to 4,000 meters. And that is 4,000 meters is the peak, is equivalent to the peak of the Matterhorn. And that's just the road here as well. The mountains continue up. They go up to about 7,500 meters. It's huge. I think I'm right in saying that it is the second highest paved mountain pass in the world, after one in Peru, which is in the Andes somewhere, which is higher. So I had no idea. I knew I was going to be riding over a mountain range, the Pamir Mountains, but I had no idea that day I was going to cycle 3 vertical kilometers. Idiot. Why didn't I just go to therapy? And that road, man, it is brutal. It is a brutal stretch of road. And the evidence of its brutality is all around you as you go up it. You wouldn't maybe notice it if you were driving up in a car. But because I'm going at about 2 miles an hour up this road, because it's so steep, you have time to look around, and the entire side of the road is just smashed glass and bits of exploded tyres and plastic bottles filled with urine that have been thrown out by the truck drivers, and empty vodka bottles, which I assume are also thrown out by truck drivers before they get to the border where their truck might be checked. So they're drinking. They're coming down or up this colossal, incredibly dangerous road, drunk off them. And there were vials next to the road as well, which I took to be amphetamines. Truck drivers taking amphetamines to keep themselves awake. And it's just every single barrier next to the road is just scarred and gouged with the wounds from cars coming around too fast and not quite making it. And on the corners they're missing, where cars have clearly misjudged a corner or their brakes have failed and they've just carried on going. And if you stop and look over the side, you can see just scratched into the surface of the granite mountain chunks where bits of cars have landed and rolled down. In the bottom of the ravine, it's just all scrap metal. I can't emphasize it enough. It's a very, very dangerous road, if I haven't made it clear. And that day, there's no twist to this part where I tell you triumphantly at the end, like in a kind of humble brag, that I was drunk when I did it. No, this day I was stone sober. And, it nearly killed me. That's not the bit that nearly killed me, but what happened was that I'd been on the road for 4.5 months or something. I was superhumanly fit at this point. But I would have to go up 100 or 200 meters and stop, and then rest at one of the corners for like 20 minutes, and those breaks got longer the more the altitude increased, because I was kind of acclimatizing to the lack of atmosphere as well. That was a tough day. It was easily the most merciless, the hardest riding day of my entire life. But it's a real contender for being the best day of my life as well. Because at the top, it was worth it immediately. It was worth it straight away. So I got up there, my legs were all swollen and my knees were stiff. And there was still snow up there. I was above the tree line now at this altitude. And the air was quite thin. Maybe that was a contributing factor, maybe a touch of hypoxia. But there's a point on that pass, as you reach the peak of that road, it bends up and then bends down again. And it's the first bit of downhill of the entire pass. And if you stand right on that point and look east, you can see the deserts of Xinjiang stretch off into the horizon. And then you turn left, you turn west, and it's ice and it's water and it's green and it's just like cool blue and violets. It's impossible to describe what that felt like. It was not to over exaggerate, but that moment standing on those, right where the Tian Shan Mountains meet the Pamir Mountains, right on that threshold where you have all of China one way and all of the west of the world the other, it was life-changing. And it felt it in the moment. And I'll never ever recapture a feeling like that. It's just not possible. Even if I got really super fit again and really dedicated myself to training and then eventually climbed Everest or something, it would not be as significant as that day was. Because if I'm prepping for Everest or something, then that simply doesn't come with all of the context and all of the struggle of traveling through Xinjiang. There's no way I can recreate all of the forces that were acting on me, like the retreating, the running away from alcohol, and all of the police harassment, and all of the stray dogs that I'd had to escape, and just the grittiness and the sharpness and the remoteness and the ruggedness and the coarseness of the desert, feeling in that moment like it had all just immediately been washed away. There's no way I could ever recreate that. And that's why I think that day on top of that pass was one of my life's biggest ever accomplishments, and will remain that way. It felt like release. It felt like China had been chewing me up in the desert, and then had just spat me out into the most astonishing, heartbreakingly beautiful landscape you can possibly imagine. And Kyrgyzstan was entirely like that. It wasn't just like a release from China. There's also a sense of personal freedom in Kyrgyzstan. And Kyrgyzstan is like a semi-authoritarian country. And while there's no like press regulation and it is technically, formally democratic, it's not really. And a lot of the police, who are underpaid and undertrained, are quite corrupt. And as a result, the individual people there don't really count on authority to support them. They don't turn to the police. They are very self-governing people. They're very self-policing. And the effect of that is not lawlessness, but a sense of freedom. The lack of law doesn't result in like banditry or something like that. It results in kind of reliance on people. It's funny, you would think that to take away the legal structures of a place like that, you would also take away any security from it. It would feel very dangerous. And it is dangerous. Because you're not ever going to be held to account by the police in Kyrgyzstan. And even if you are, if you have a bit of cash in your pocket, you'll be fine. The people who will hold you to account are the people that you're interacting with, like your neighbours or other travellers or the nomads who rely on the land for their life. If you mistreat them, then you will suffer community punishment, the punishment of their community, whatever it is. But other than that, as long as you're just not an idiot and you are not rude and you have cash in your pocket, you can survive there. If there's a place where you can have access to infrastructure if you want it, but you can also be completely off the grid, it's there. And I feel bad saying that, because I don't want people to go there and discover it and fall in love with it like I did, because it does feel a little bit like the world's best kept secret at the moment. Or it was back then. Things changed in 2021. There was a centralization of power, so it might be different now. But I loved it. It was my sort of place. A place where people fix their cars rather than trade them in and get a new one. And people help each other and rely on each other. I like that. The people of Kyrgyzstan were the friendliest of everywhere I've ever been in my life. I still have plans vaguely to retire there if possible, if my body can still handle it when I'm a little older. If there is one major problem with Kyrgyzstan, it is the availability and the cheapness of alcohol. So I'd been there a few days. I stayed in a place called Sobriety, which is another one of my favourite places that I've ever visited, which is a kind of like junction for the country. The road splits off in 3 key different directions. And I was going north, up to Bishkek, the capital. And in Sobriety, I knew that I was going to be on my own in the wilderness for quite a long time, several days, with no guarantee of any help or support. And for some strange reason in Sobriety, I bought 3 bottles of vodka. And I don't know why I did that. And my attitude had changed after Kyrgyzstan. It had become... I didn't realise at the time, but the whole journey through China was so stressful and it felt like such a burden, and every day was a fight to get where I needed to be, that once I'd left the country, all of that weight just went off my shoulders. And the response was a feeling of irresponsibility and personal freedom and alcohol. I left Sobriety and I still wasn't drinking very heavily. I was heading towards a town called Jalalabad, and as I approached it, I was about halfway there. I'd come over another mountain range, another pass, and I was on the other side, and it flattened out for a while through some towns. And I was cycling along the highway, and I got a puncture, and it was really the first, I think, puncture that I'd had on the journey on that bike. And it revealed a problem that I didn't have a specific tool I needed to fix the puncture. It's too boring to explain, but I was riding a fat bike and the valve holes were different, and I didn't have a replacement. I needed to file out the valve hole to make it wider to accommodate my inner tube. But I couldn't take the bike with me. Jalalabad was 40 kilometers away, and I had no guarantee that I was going to be able to hitchhike or anything like that, so I couldn't fix the bike, I couldn't take it with me. I needed to stash it somewhere. And I was standing on a bridge on the highway with a river that ran underneath it. And from this bridge, I saw a tiny little island in the middle of the river. And I was like, perfect. What I'll do is I'll take all of my gear and I'll cross the river, put my bike and all of my gear on that little island, and then cross back and then find a way to head to the town. And that's what I did. It felt like it would be safe there. People were less likely to stumble across it by accident there. So I went off to this town. I stayed there for an evening, got what I needed from a local bazaar, and some more vodka, and headed back to this tiny little island. And I should stress, this river that I'm talking about was not like a little stream or a brook. It was quite fast flowing. The current was very strong, and it was an incredible struggle to get my stuff over onto it. But it was a powerful river, and it was up to about my chin, just below my chin, as I waded across. And the first time I did it, I had to carry my bike over my head, then go back and get my pannier bags, carry them one at a time, across, back. And I stripped naked to do it because I was slightly out of vision of the road from here, so I took off all my clothes and left them on the bank and was walking across the river naked with my boots on to put everything there. I came back, got dressed, and went off to find a way into town. Got the things I needed, returned, stripped naked. And I'd been drinking in the taxi as well, because it was 40 kilometers, but it was like a bus that stops, and it was a long journey. So I was already a little bit tipsy by the time I returned to the river. And I was the whole way I'd been like, well, what if my stuff just isn't there anymore? What if somebody saw me crossing the river with all this expensive Western gear, a bike that was worth $2,000, and pannier bags that were full of laptops and camera equipment and, lots of expensive things. It would be an easy gig for them to just... What am I going to do? How am I going to track him down? There are no police. There are no police. It's not that... there are none. None up there. And it seemed very unlikely that if it had been stolen up there on the plateau, it's not going to turn up on Facebook Marketplace and I can track them down and go and fight them and get it back. It's just not on the cards. So I was super anxious because that bike by then had become my entire life. It was my home. It had my sleeping bag and my tent on the back of it. It had everything I needed to survive. So if it was gone, that was it. It was over. The whole journey was over. But that is not what happened. So I returned to the river, stripped naked, apart from my boots, because the river was rocky. Waded across to the little island in the middle of the river. And the first thing I did was went and got my insulated cycling trousers. It's very cold on the mountain, so I've been wearing padded trousers, padded pants. And I went to shake them, to put them on. And as I shook them, a snake about the width of my forearm and a vivid, disgusting, vibrant green colour hissed and slithered out of the trouser leg. My trousers, I suppose, being the only warm thing on the island. The snake had gravitated towards them, climbed inside, and I had woken it up. And it slithered between my feet and away into the water. And I must have jumped about 15 feet in the air. And a noise came out of me that I've never made before, and I don't think I've ever made since, which was a kind of real primal fear noise, which is not a scream, but like a moan, like this, kind of like that, like horror. And I'd had no previous fear of snakes. But when one of them climbs out of when a big snake like that, it was actually a Central Asian cobra, I discovered later. When one of them is in your pants, when you have a snake in your pants, miles from anywhere, it is a different experience than seeing one in your local pet shop. So it took me a long time just to settle down from that experience. But I knew that I was stuck on an island in the middle of the river, and there could be plenty more snakes. So what I did was, there was a little tree there, and I got a stick, and I was beating the floor and all of my possessions, like I was like St. Patrick, like banishing the snakes from Ireland. I was on this little island trying to scare away any snakes that might be still in my gear or in my clothes. And I was shaky. It was like a massive spike of adrenaline and then an immediate slump. And I was kind of shaky. And I still had to get all of my gear back across to the other side of the river. So I thought what I would do is I would take my 2 pannier bags. These are like bike bags, quite big things with handles. To reduce the amount of time that it would take to do everything, I would do them in one trip. So I picked up my pannier bags. I'm still bollock naked, and I hold them above my head, and they're really heavy. They're full of my gear. There's like laptops and cameras and all sorts, and tools, lots of tools. And I step into the water, and I'm fighting the current with my hands above my head, completely naked. And I start walking, and the water's rising and rising and rising. When I'm in the middle of the river, and it's up to my chin, the snake reappears in the water right in front of me, right below my face here. I see its head emerge from the top of the water, and it bends and it swims back down the whole arch of it like this until its tail flicks the surface of the water, and it dives and it's gone. And the fear I was paralyzed. I dropped both of the bags in an effort to kind of push myself away from the snake. It was right in front of me. I threw myself back in the water, and I let go of the bags and splashed around and thrashed, and managed to grab one of the other bags and got my footing. I'd kind of jumped myself to a shallower piece of the water, and I threw the bag to the bank with all my strength, and then I dove to grab the one that was floating away, the second bag, and it was just at my fingertips. And it was drifting away, and I pushed myself again, and then the current took me, and suddenly it was panic. It was panic in the water that I was convinced was now filled with snakes. I was just convinced that I was surrounded by snakes. The current had lifted me off my feet and was dragging me to God knows where. I should stress, this was not like a white water river. It wasn't wildly out of control. In fact, it kind of just drifts off into a reservoir a little bit further down the mountain. But it was strong enough to put me under at several points. And it moved me about 1 kilometre down the river, I think. In which time, I'm not sure, I was panicking the whole time. I couldn't swim against the current, I knew that. So I was trying to see if I could get some traction on the floor of the river. But that wasn't working either, and I couldn't reach either side. And it was dunking me under, and I was breathing, because I was panicking so hard. I was gulping in river water, and spluttering, and choking. And for lack of a better word, I don't want to make this sound more dramatic than it was, but I was really at risk of drowning. And eventually the river bent, and it pushed me onto the bank that I was trying to get to anyway. Not like further down the bank, but to the correct side of the river. And I walked back about 1 kilometre through this farmland, completely naked, freezing cold, and absolutely terrified. Yeah. And I picked up the bag that I'd managed to throw to the bank. It was kind of in the water. I managed to fish it out. It got tangled up. and I dragged it to where my stuff, my clothes and my bag that I got from the town, where that was on the riverbank. And I slumped on the floor naked, and I reached into that bag and I pulled out a bottle of vodka, and I drank about half of the entire thing in one go. I just wanted to be drunk, fast as possible, and I could deal with my problems later. When I was drunk enough to get the confidence back, later in the day, I went back and one by one I just thought, you know what, fuck it. If I die, I die. And I went back across the river and I got the bike and everything else, all my clothes and stuff, and brought it to the riverbank. And then I even tried to fix the bike, even after I'd been drinking. After all of that, I didn't really know what to do. And I didn't want to hang around where I knew there were snakes. So I didn't know what to do apart from to try to fix the bike, just to keep busy, I think. And while I was there, I'd moved it to the side of the road, on this bridge. I turned the bike upside down, and I took the tyre off. I left the wheel on the frame, and I took the tyre off. And I sat there and slowly started fixing the puncture. And from out of nowhere, really, these 3 kids appeared. And it was 2 girls and a young boy. And it was just out of curiosity, I think. And they were holding flowers. They'd been in a nearby field and were picking flowers. And just out of sheer curiosity, they came over to talk to me. And one of them spoke a little bit of English, and I spoke a little bit of Russian. And after kind of some introductions through kind of shared broken language a little bit, they helped me fix the bike. We took turns in pumping the air in it and that kind of thing. And while they were there, it was so good to have company after that. But while they were there, and they were kind of like playing with, I was in no rush, so they were like playing with the wheels and the brakes and stuff. And when they weren't looking, I was swigging vodka out of the bag and putting it back. And they were so joyful and just so giving, so generous, just so kind and sweet and smart and funny and good company, while I sat there and kind of... They distracted me from what had happened. Because what had happened, remember, is that I'd lost half of my stuff. That bag that had disappeared was full of stuff. I think my laptop was in there. And camping tools or something, I forget. But I know it was important and I needed it. And then they just came over and kept me company. And eventually, one of I think they were all siblings, like sisters and brother. And one of their sisters arrived who was older, on this kind of like petrol cart thing. And she didn't like me. She looked at me very suspiciously. And the little girl who spoke some English with me, she went to get on the cart, but before she did, she ran over to me and she gave me some of the flowers that she'd been picking. And then she didn't say anything, and then she got on the back of the cart. And as it started to pull off, as it drifted away into the distance, she stood up on the back of it, holding the side. And she blew me this giant theatrical kiss, like going up on her tiptoes to really emphasize it. And I watched the kind of bike disappear until it had gone round a corner and over the hill. And I burst into tears. Yeah. But after that day, I never really stopped drinking again. It got worse and worse after that. And it's no surprise to me, really, looking back, that a lot of my hallucinations in delirium tremens involve snakes, despite the fact that I'm not really afraid of snakes. Even now, I'm okay with snakes. But they're in my hallucinations. In fact, after that, In fact, after that period, I started seeing snakes even in sobriety for quite a long time. Especially when I woke up, I would be seeing snakes for a little while, just scattering out of my vision. And that got worse the longer the drinking went on. But that is where it started. That day, encountering the snake in the river when I was completely vulnerable, literally naked with my hands up. And then the fear of that, and of losing so much stuff, feeling very isolated and very alone. It never got better again. After Kyrgyzstan, I crossed the border into Kazakhstan, and I took all of that baggage with me. All of that fear and the alcohol, which was increasing every day. I took all of that to Kazakhstan, which is a less forgiving place. And that's where everything really went sideways. Okay, look, thank you for indulging me today. I just wanted to tell you a story. Look, if you've made it this far, you can read about that in my book. There is still some available in the link in the description. But thank you very much for watching. And as always, good luck out there.